So, good evening. I am Professor Claude Destray. I'm a member of the faculty here at the Cornell School, the director of the Center on Rights Development. I'd like to welcome all of you to the 16th Annual Center on Rights Development Spring Symposium. The Center on Rights Development, or CORD, is the oldest center at the Joseph Corvell School of International Studies. What makes CORD unique is that, other than me, the entire staff programs are run by Corvell students. CORD picks a new theme each year based on one of the three pillars of human rights. We use the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, known as the ICESCR. We always do the ICESCR and then we can't remember what it actually stands for usually when we're having these discussions. The ICESCR is probably the least known of the three major human rights documents that make up what is known as the International Bill of Human Rights. The others being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. But the ICESCR is filled with grand human rights aspirations, and I recommend it to you as a good read, although sometimes difficult to figure out what its intentions are. In past years, CORD has focused on such themes as the right to health in emergency settings, the right to water, and the right to education. Next year, CORD's theme will be centered around gender rights. This year, my colleagues have put together an amazing symposium, Sovereign and Sacred, Indigenous Rights and Environmental Justice, with national and international experts presenting for the next few days. Please take a good look and a careful look at the symposium flyer, which you have, for panel titles, days, and times. Our closing keynote will be President Alejandro Toledo of Peru on Friday at 5 p.m. If you would like to attend, please do not forget to RSVP. You'll need to go to CORD's website for instructions. That will be very helpful. I am very pleased to introduce to you our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz grew up in rural Oklahoma, the daughter of a tenant farmer and a part Indian mother. She has been active in the international indigenous movement for more than 4 decades and is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues, and is co-founder and representative of the Indigenous World Association for Human Rights Work at the United Nations. After receiving her PhD in history at the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, she taught in the newly established Native American Studies program at California State University, Hayward. I actually looked for myself at that program at one time, and helped found the Department of Ethnic Studies and Women's Studies. Her 1977 book, The Great Sioux Nation, was the fundamental document at the first International Conference on Indigenous Peoples of Americas held at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz is the author or editor of 7 other books, including Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, and a memoir trilogy. Her most recent book is An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. She lives in San Francisco and organizes everywhere. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz.
Can you hear me? Is the microphone working?
Yes.
Okay, good. Because I have a very soft voice, so if you can't hear me, let me know. Well, I want to thank the Center for Human Rights Development, that I have to get used to calling it CORD because I can't remember what it means if I call it CORDs. Here at the University of Denver, I believe I was here in the 80s when I was doing work with refugees in Central America, and it's so good to be back and to see how it's developed in such a profound way, and more important now than ever. So I'm really grateful to be invited to be the keynote speaker at this 16th Annual Rights Symposium. I especially want to thank Symposium Coordinator Kristen Renda for her tireless work and support. I just saw a tiny bit of it myself, but I knew that was going on with everyone. She's wonderful. And thank all of you for being here this evening. After the decade of the 1960s, as a student and activist, then a university professor, I became involved in the international human rights field as Native Americans and other indigenous peoples sought redress at the United Nations, beginning in the mid-1970s. And since that time, this has been my vocation. Never paid, by the way, vocation is an unpaid word, and the heart of my continued social justice activism. This evening I want to focus on the source of United States predatory militarism in the world today, which I argue is the principal barrier to achieving justice here and in the world, as well as preventing the demise of humanity due to imminent destruction of our habitat. And this is based on the continued overconsumption, also of ourselves, that is inseparable from the U.S. military dominance in the world today. So I've titled this talk tonight, Native American Nations Survival and the Future of the United States. And I would add the future of humanity. Some 200 miles southeast of Denver, an unforgettable incident occurred at the end of November in 1864. It was not singular, rather very common from the time of first settlement at Jamestown through the founding of the United States Empire and throughout the 19th century in North America. But there was something about it that sears the brain, perhaps because it was during the Civil War and the Colorado Volunteers had been commissioned by the War Department. It was an extensive investigation that details the gruesome sadism that took place. And unlike thousands of other such U.S. military massacres, it was not recorded as a battle, such as the Wounded Knee and Washita massacres and others were. Still, in U.S. Army annals, those were battles won. Preoccupied with the Civil War in the East, the Lincoln administration did little to prevent vicious and even genocidal actions on the part of territorial authorities, consisting of volunteer Indian haters, such as Kit Carson in the New Mexico Territory. And that refers, of course, to the forced relocation of the people of the Navajo Nation, 4 years incarceration. Half the people died during that time. The mode of maintaining settler law and order set the pattern for post-war genocide. In the most infamous incident involving militias, the 1st and 3rd Colorado Volunteers carried out the Sand Creek Massacre. Although assigned to guard the road to Santa Fe from Denver, the units mainly engaged in raiding and looting indigenous communities. John Shivington, an ambitious Colorado Territory politician known as the Fighting Parson, led the 3rd Colorado. By 1861, displaced and captive Cheyenne and Arapaho people, under the leadership of the great peace seeker Black Kettle, were incarcerated in a U.S. military reservation called Sand Creek, near Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado Territory. They camped under a white flag of truce and had federal permission to hunt buffalo to feed themselves. In early 1864, the Colorado territorial governor informed them that they could no longer leave the reservation to hunt. Despite their compliance with the order, Shivington took 700 Colorado volunteers to the reservation. Without provocation or warning, they attacked, leaving dead 105 women and children and 28 men. Later, the Federal Commissioner of Indian Affairs would denounce the action, saying that the people had been, quote, butchered in cold blood by troops in the service of the United States, unquote. In its 1865 investigation, the Congress Joint Committee on the Conduct of the Civil War recorded testimonies and published a report that documented the aftermath of the killings, when Shivington and his volunteers burned all the teepees and stole horses. Worse, after the smoke cleared, they had returned and finished off the injured, while scalping and mutilating the corpses, women and men, young and old, children and babies. Then they decorated their weapons and caps with body parts, fetuses, penises, breasts, and vulvas. And in the words of Acoma poet Simon Ortiz, stuck them on their hats to dry, their fingers greasy and slick. Once back in Denver, they displayed the trophies to the adoring public in Denver's Apollo Theater and in saloons. Yet despite the detailed reports of the deeds, neither Shivington nor any of his men were reprimanded or prosecuted, signaling a free field for killing. The Cheyenne survivors of the massacre, which included the leader, Black Kettle, and his wife, were relocated to Indian Territory on a small reservation alongside the Washita River, not far from where I grew up, where 2 days after the 4th anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre, Colonel George Armstrong Custer tried to eliminate the surviving Cheyenne. When Black Kettle, who had survived Sand Creek, received word that mounted troops of the 7th Cavalry were leaving their fort and headed for the Cheyenne Reservation, he and his wife rode out at dawn in a snowstorm, unarmed, hoisting a white flag. Custer ordered the soldiers to fire, and a moment later, Black Kettle and his wife lay dead. The 7th Cavalry continued on to the unarmed Cheyenne settlement and murdered over 100 Cheyenne women and children and men, taking ghoulish trophies afterwards. In U.S. annals, that massacre is listed as the successful Battle of Washita. Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird writes that the colonization of American Indian nations, peoples, and lands provide the United States the economic and material resources needed to cast its imperialist gaze globally, is a fact that is simultaneously obvious within and yet continually obscured by what is essentially a settler colony's national construction of itself as an ever more perfect, multicultural, multiracial democracy. The status of American Indians as sovereign nations colonized by the United States continues to haunt. Well, the conventional narrative of U.S. history routinely segregates the Indian Wars as a subspecialization within the dubious category of the West. But the architecture of U.S. world dominance was designed and tested by the period of continental U.S. militarism from 1780 to 1890, the so-called Indian Wars. They started on the Atlantic coast. So if it's the West, it's the whole continent. Even at war during the 20th century, there was a continuation of counterinsurgency, the method used. Central America, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. The opening of the 21st century saw a new, even more brazen form of U.S. militarism and imperialism explode on the world, followed by 2 major military invasions and hundreds of small wars employing U.S. special forces around the globe. One highly regarded military analyst and counterinsurgency advocate argues that there are direct connections between the U.S. Indian Wars and what he considers the United States' bright imperialist past and future. Robert D. Kaplan, in his 2005 book, Imperial Grunts, presented several case studies that he considered highly successful operations. The first one may make you laugh, Yemen, Colombia, Mongolia, and the Philippines, in addition to ongoing complex projects in the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, and Iraq. While many U.S. citizens, probably everyone here, and many of our elected representatives called for ending the U.S. military interventions we knew about, including Iraq and Afghanistan, Kaplan hailed protracted and counterinsurgencies in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Pacific. He presented a guide for the U.S. controlling those areas of the world based on its having achieved continental dominance in North America by means of counterinsurgency and employing total and unlimited war. Kaplan became one of the principal intellectual boosters for U.S. power through the tried and true first way of war. This is the way of war dating to the British colonial period that military historian John Grenier describes as a combination of unlimited war and irregular war, a military tradition that accepts, legitimizes, and encourages attacks upon and the destruction of non-combatants, villages, and agricultural resources, in shockingly violent campaigns to achieve their goals of conquest, unquote. That military historian, by the way, is a professor of military history at the U.S. Air Force Academy and is a U.S. Air Force officer. It's an interesting book, The First Way of War. Kaplan sums up his thesis in the prologue to his Imperial Grunts, which he subtitles Engine Country. He writes, by the turn of the 21st century, the United States military had already appropriated the entire earth and was ready to flood the most obscure areas of it with troops at a moment's notice. The Pentagon divided the planet into 5 area commands, similar to the way that the Indian country of the American West had been divided in the mid-19th century by the U.S. Army. According to soldiers and Marines I met, Kaplan speaking, on the ground in far-flung corners of the earth, the comparison with the 19th century was apt. Welcome to Engine Country was the refrain I heard from troops from Colombia to the Philippines and in Afghanistan and Iraq. The war on terrorism was really about training the frontier, unquote. In short, the war on terror is another Indian war. This time, Arabs as the Indians. Kaplan goes on to ridicule elites in New York and Washington who debate imperialism in grand historical terms, while individuals from all the armed forces interpret policy according to the particular circumstances they face and are indifferent to or unaware of the fact that they are part of an imperialist project. To them, and for many U.S. Americans, the United States military power is the heart of their patriotism, and the military is revered as no other governmental institution is. Pointing to the intentionality of U.S. colonialism in North America, Kaplan challenges the concept of manifest destiny, arguing that, quote, it was not inevitable that the United States should have an empire in the North American continent, unquote. Rather, he argues, it was the work of small groups of frontiersmen separated from each other by great distances. Here Kaplan refers to what Grenier, the military historian, calls rangers, self-organized settlers who destroyed indigenous towns and fields and food supplies, murdering the inhabitants. The most famous organizer of rangers was, of course, the Tennessee militia under Andrew Jackson, the good deeds for which he became a general in the U.S. Army and then president. Kaplan equates these settler vigilantes to the modern special forces. He acknowledges that the regular army provided lethal backup for settler counterinsurgency in slaughtering the buffalo, the food supply of the plains people, as well as making continuous raids on settlements to kill or confine the families of the indigenous resistance fighters. Kaplan summarizes the genealogy of U.S. militarism today. Whereas the average American at the dawn of the new millennium found patriotic inspiration in the legacies of the Civil War and World War II, when the evils of slavery and fascism were confronted and vanquished. For commissioned and non-commissioned officers, the U.S. Army's defining moment was fighting the Indians. As an example of many, on March 19, 2003, near the Iraqi desert in Kuwait, Associated Press reporter Ellen Nickmeyer illustrated the symbolic power of Indian wars as a source of U.S. military memory and practice. Tank crews from the Alpha Company, 4th Battalion, 64th Armored Regiment performed what they call a Seminole Indian war dance before convoying to a position near the Iraqi border. Captain Wolford's men leaped into the air and waved rifles in an impromptu war dance, desert war dance. He said to the reporter, "We will be entering Iraq as an army of liberation, not domination." The Seminole war dance is serious business. It's done a lot in the Army. The 3 declared wars against the Seminole Nation in Florida Everglades, the 3 declared wars that never seem to show up in U.S. history textbooks, span a 42-year period of time, the longest war in U.S. history, from 1816 to 1838. The Seminole Wars remain deeply embedded in the U.S. military tradition and practice. And it's not just ceremonial, as in that war dance. In early 2011, a Yemeni citizen, Ali Hamza al-Balu, was serving a life sentence at Guantanamo as an enemy combatant. A military tribunal having convicted him of crimes associated with his service to al-Qaeda as Osama bin Laden's media secretary. In arguing on appeal that Balul's conviction be upheld, a Pentagon lawyer, Navy Captain Edward S. White, relied on a precedent from an 1818 Army tribunal. In his 37-page military commission's brief, Captain White wrote, quote, "Not only was the Seminole belligerency unlawful, but much like modern-day al-Qaeda, the very way in which the Seminoles waged war against the U.S. targets, itself violate the customs and usages of war." The Center for Constitutional Rights objected to this passage in the government's brief, writing, "The court should reject the government's notable reliance on the Seminole Wars of the 1800s, a genocide that led to the Trail of Tears. The government's characterization of Native American resistance to the United States as much like modern-day al-Qaeda is not only factually wrong, but overtly racist, and cannot present any legitimate legal basis to uphold Mr. Balul's conviction." In response, the Pentagon's General Counsel issued a letter stating that the U.S. government stood by its precedent. So the Seminole Wars are still being fought. This isn't just history. So a little background to that case in 2011. Following the U.S. Invasion of Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, rather than bestowing the status of prisoner of war on Afghan detainees, which would have given them certain rights under the Geneva Convention, they were designated as unlawful combatants. And most were interned at the U.S. Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay and other places, secret sites around the world. We still don't know how many, where they were, all of them. As such, the detainees were subjected to torture by U.S. interrogators and shamelessly monitored by civilian psychologists and medical personnel. Much of the rhetoric following the declaration of the War on Terror after the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 references U.S.-American militaristic memory of the wars against Native nations. In response to questions and condemnations from around the globe, a University of California international law professor, John C. Yu, on leave to serve as Assistant U.S. Attorney General in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, penned in March 2003 what became the infamous torture memo. Despite strong objections to the unlawful combatant moniker, not much was made at the time of one of the precedents Yu employed to defend the designation unlawful combatant. This was the U.S. Supreme Court's 1873 opinion in Modoc Indian prisoners. In 1872, the Modoc leader, Kent Puash, also known as Captain Jack, led some 150 of his people to return to their own country in Northern California after the U.S. Army had rounded them up and forced them to share a reservation with people they were unrelated to in Oregon. 53 insurgent fighters from this group were surrounded by the U.S. troops after they returned and the Oregon militia, and they were forced to take refuge in the barren and rugged lava beds around Lassen, a volcano lava bed, a part of their ancestral homeland that they knew every inch of. It was also sacred land to them. More than 1,000 troops commanded by General Edward R.S. Canby, a former Civil War general, attempted to capture the resistors, but had no success as the Modocs engaged in effective guerrilla warfare. Before the Civil War, General Canby had built his military career fighting in the Second Seminole War and later in the invasion of Mexico in 1846. Posted to Utah on the eve of the Civil War, he had led attacks against the Navajos and then began his Civil War service in New Mexico. Therefore, Canby was a seasoned Indian killer. In negotiations between the general and Kent Puash, the Modoc leader killed the general and the other commissioners when they would allow no resolution other than Modoc total surrender. In response, the Army Command dispatched another former Civil War general with more than 1,000 additional soldiers as reinforcements. And in April 1873, these troops attacked the Modoc stronghold in the lava beds, this time forcing the Modoc resistors to scatter. After 4 months of fighting that cost the United States near equal to $10 million today, and the lives of more than 400 of its soldiers and a general, the nationwide backlash against the Modocs was vengeful. Kent Puash and several other captured Modocs were captured, tried, and hanged at Alcatraz. And the Modoc families were scattered and incarcerated on reservations as far away as Oklahoma. Kent Puash's corpse was embalmed and exhibited at circuses around the country. Drawing the legal analogy between the Modoc prisoners and the Guantanamo detainees, Assistant U.S. Attorney General Yu employed the legal category of homo sacer. In Roman law, homo sacer is a person banned from society, excluded from its legal protections, but still subject to the sovereign's power. Anyone may kill a homo sacer without it being considered murder. To buttress his claim that the detainees could be denied prisoner of war status, you quoted from the 1873 Modoc Indian prisoner's opinion, which read in part, "All the laws and customs of civilized warfare may not be applicable to an armed conflict with the Indian tribes upon our western frontiers." Thereby, anyone could be defined as Indian. Anyone who could be defined as Indian could be tortured or killed legally. And they could also be held criminally responsible for engaging any U.S. soldier. The U.S. military established a pattern during and after the Vietnam War of forcibly removing indigenous peoples from sites deemed strategic for the placement of military bases. The peoples of the Bikini Atoll of the South Pacific and Puerto Rico's Vieques Island are perhaps the best known examples. But there were also the Inuit of Thule, Greenland, who were relocated, and the thousands of Okinawans, Chamorros of Guam, indigenous peoples of Micronesia, and the Chagosian people of Diego Garcia Island in the Indian Ocean. During the harsh deportation of the Micronesians in the 1970s, the press took some notice. In response to one reporter's question, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said of the Micronesians, "There are only 90,000 people out there. Who gives a damn?" This is a statement of permissive genocide. By the beginning of the 21st century, the United States operated more than 900 military bases around the world, not counting all the ones in the United States, Puerto Rico, including 287 in Germany, 130 in Japan, 106 in South Korea, 89 in Italy, 57 in the British Isles, 21 in Portugal, and 19 in Turkey. The number also comprised additional bases or installations located in Aruba, Australia, Djibouti, Egypt, Israel, Singapore, Thailand, Kyrgyzstan, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, Crete, Sicily, Iceland, Romania, Bulgaria, Honduras, Colombia, and Cuba at Guantanamo Bay, among many other locations in some 150 countries, along with those recently added in Iraq and Afghanistan. We see the military all around us and in the media. We kind of take it for granted that it's benign. But as military historian John Grenier notes, the U.S. militarization is not new. It has deep historical roots, reaching into the nation's Anglo-settler past and continuing through unrelenting wars of conquest and ethnic cleansing over 3 centuries. Grenier writes, quote, "Beyond its sheer military utility, Americans also find a use for the first way of war in the construction of an American identity." I'd add that the astronomical, and I think Denver's an important place to, as many are these days, to say this astronomical number of firearms owned by U.S. civilians, with the Second Amendment as a sacred mandate, is also intricately related to militaristic culture. The militias referred to in the Second Amendment are those civilians who were mobilized to attack indigenous towns, burning their fields to take their land. Everyday life and the culture in general are damaged by ramped up militarization. And this includes academia, particularly the social sciences, with psychologists and anthropologists being recruited as advisors to the military. Anthropologist David H. Price, in his indispensable book, I highly recommend, Weaponizing Anthropology, remarks that, quote, anthropology has always fed between the lines of war. Anthropology was born of European and U.S. colonial wars. Price sees an accelerated pace of militarization in the early 21st century. Quoting Price, today's weaponization of anthropology and other social sciences has been a long time coming, and post-9/11 America's cultural climate of fear, coupled with reductions in traditional academic funding, provided the conditions of a sort of perfect storm for the militarization of the discipline and the academy as a whole. So going back to Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird, this book, by the way, I highly recommend, The Transit of Empire. It's a book 3 years ago it was published. It's an amazing book. Jody writes, the story of the New World is horror, the story of America a crime. Every time I read that line, I have an image of someone doing, it would take a lot of people doing it actually, an art installation, a huge project of putting yellow tape around the whole borders of the United States. It's a crime scene. It is necessary to start with the origin of the United States as a settler state and its explicit intention to occupy the continent. These origins contain the historical seeds of genocide. Any true history of the United States must focus on what happened to and with indigenous peoples and what still happens to them. That is, if we wish to understand the present and change it, we have to know that this past is the present. A race to innocent is what occurs when individuals assume they are innocent of complicity in structures of domination and oppression. This concept captures the understandable assumption made by, say, new immigrants or children of recent immigrants to any country. They cannot be responsible, they assume, for what occurred in their adopted country's past. Yet in a settler society that has not come to terms with its past, whatever historical trauma was entailed in settling the land affects the assumptions and behavior of living generations of any given time, including immigrants and the children of recent immigrants. We need to make immigrants and refugees and their children and the children of immigrants and refugees understand this colonialist past that exists, that this is what they're joining, and that they have a choice of becoming a settler or having the settler state of mind, embracing militaristic patriotism or not. Another aspect of the demand for U.S. dominion is a ghoulish one that appears under the guise of science. Despite the passage in 1990 of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, some researchers under the cloak of science have fought tooth and nail not to release the remains and burial offerings of some 2 million indigenous people held in storage, much of it uncatalogued. In the Smithsonian Institution and other museums and by universities, state historical societies, National Park Service offices, warehouses, and curio shops. Until the 1990s, archaeologists and physical anthropologists claimed to need these remains, which they labeled resources or data, but rarely as human remains. They claimed they needed them for purported scientific experimentation, but most were randomly stored in boxes, in storage spaces. The whole Smithsonian Institution attic of the old building is filled with these boxes. of Indian human remains. In doing so, they also challenged the definition of Native American and the claimant's right to sovereignty. They even accused Native Americans of being anti-science for seeking to repatriate the remains of their ancestors. However, since anthropologist Franz Boas in 1911 discredited the theories of racial superiority and inferiority upon which such research was premised, little actual examination of the indigenous body parts has taken place. When Ishi, identified by Anglos in 1911 as the last of the Yahi people of Northern California, when he died in 1916, the U.S. Berkeley anthropologist who had studied him and his culture, Arthur Kroeber, insisted on an indigenous traditional burial and no autopsy, according to Ishi's wishes. When asked about the cause of science, Kroeber said, "If there's any talk about the interest of science, say for me that science can go to hell. Besides, I cannot believe that any scientific value is materially involved. We have hundreds of Indian skeletons that nobody ever comes to study." Despite Kroeber's stance, Ishi's brain was removed and preserved and sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. As anthropologist Eric Davis observes, the bodies have never had scientific value. Rather, they have become a fetish, a marker of value, the power of which derives specifically from the obscuring of the referent to which it originally referred. Davis claims that Indian identity in its material form, the dead native body, has functioned for a very long time and with increasing power as a fetish, as war trophies marking the possession of land by those who have conquered it already. So we must ask, how then can U.S. society come to terms with its past and change direction for the future? How can it acknowledge responsibility? The late Native historian Jack Forbes always stressed that while living persons are not responsible for what their ancestors did, they are responsible for the society they live in, which is a product of that past. Assuming this responsibility provides a means of survival and liberation, not just for Native people. Everyone and everything in the world is affected, for the most part negatively, by U.S. dominance and intervention, often violently through direct military means or through proxies. It must be an urgent concern and priority if humanity is to survive. And indigenous peoples offer possibilities for life after empire, possibilities that neither erase the crimes of colonialism nor require the disappearance of the original peoples colonized under the guise of including them as individuals through assimilation. That process rightfully starts by honoring the treaties the United States made with indigenous nations, by restoring all sacred sites, starting with the Black Hills, the Pahasaka of the Sioux, and including most federally held parks and land, and all stolen sacred items and human remains, and by payment of sufficient reparations for the reconstruction and expansion of Native nations. In the process, the continent will be radically reconfigured, physically and psychologically. For the future to be realized, it will require extensive educational programs and the full support and active participation of the descendants of settlers, enslaved Africans, and colonized Mexicans, as well as immigrant populations. Again, in the words of Acoma poet Simon Ortiz from his book of poetry on the Sand Creek Massacre, "The future will not be mad with loss and waste, though the memory will be there. Eyes will become kind and deep, and the bones of this nation will mend after the revolution."
much. Although we met for the first time this evening, I'm delighted to find a kindred spirit. Danny, thank you so much for recommending your friend and colleague for our opening. I teach a number of standalone courses on things like forced labor and human trafficking, another one on torture, another on international humanitarian law on conflict and war. I see them as interconnected, and then most see them as very disparate topics. So I'm always very appreciative of someone who knows how to connect the dots between the past and the present between different disciplines. I think, unfortunately, even here at Korbel, we operate under silos. We have 5-degree programs, and students and faculty tend to stick with those. It's fairly classic here as the director of the Human Rights degree program. I see that human rights students and security students rarely intermix, talk to each other. There are wonderful few exceptions. And instead of talking about human rights and national security, maybe we should be talking about human security. But that has yet to happen, even though we clearly have the resources. I also want to thank you for raising 2 notorious figures for me. John Yoo, since some of my students here know that I have considered John Yoo to be my personal nemesis, and that I would gladly give up my entire career to have the chance to prosecute Henry Kissinger for war crimes and crimes against humanity.
He doesn't travel.
He can't because there are warrants out for his arrest in many places. So I thank you very much for making us see the connection between what we tend to think are separate pieces, and we're not very good at connecting these dots and seeing that it's a part of a continuous whole. So I'll have more time to talk to you privately, so I just want to open it up if you're willing to take some questions. I also, as I mentioned, the book, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, is available in the back. I would encourage you to read it. And I hope at the end of this evening that the DU bookstore will have no copies left to take back, so that I would encourage you to do that. And I know they take credit cards because they just took mine, so take yours as well, because I know nobody carries cash. So if all right with you, I'd like to open this up for questions. And if you want to make a comment, try to not be too terribly polemic about the process, but comments are okay as well.